Look at a map of the world right now. Any map. Political, geographic, satellite. Doesn't matter. Now look at the green parts. The forests. The areas that show tree cover. What you are looking at is not the world as it was. It is what remains after something happened. Something so large and so fast that it rewrote the surface of the planet within a single human lifetime, and then was quietly reclassified as normal. The map you are looking at is a map of what survived, what did not survive, what occupied those now empty spaces before roads and farms and cities arrived, was not simply trees in the way you picture trees. What was there had been growing, undisturbed, since before the Roman Empire existed, since before most human civilizations began. In some cases, since before the concept of a civilization had any meaning at all, and in most places it was gone within 60 years. This video is about what was actually there, not as an ecological footnote, not as background information, but as the central fact of the world that existed before the one you were born into. A world most people walking this earth today have no access to, no memory of, and no way to imagine. Let me tell you what nobody puts in the history books alongside the dates and the kings and the battles. When the first European explorers arrived in what is now California in the 1500s, they described standing at the edge of a forest and being unable to see where it ended, in any direction. Not because the forest was dense with undergrowth, because the trees were so tall and the canopy so high above them that the forest interior looked more like the inside of a building than anything they had ever experienced outdoors. The trees they were looking at had been there, some of them since the year 500 AD, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They were already 1,000 years old when Columbus crossed the Atlantic. These were not the tallest trees. These were not even the oldest trees. These were simply the ones the explorers happened to reach first. Coast redwoods in Northern California regularly exceeded 350 feet in height, taller than the Statue of Liberty from base to torch. They were not rare exceptions. They were the dominant species across 2 million continuous acres. The kauri trees of New Zealand reached ages of over 2,000 years. Their trunks were so wide that early Maori used hollowed kauri logs as ocean-going canoes. Single logs, large enough to carry crews across open Pacific water. The Wollemi pine of Australia, discovered alive in 1994 in a hidden canyon outside Sydney, is a species that scientists had only known from fossils. Those fossils were 200 million years old. The tree was alive, growing, in a place nobody had looked. These trees, and thousands of species like them across every continent, were not background scenery in human history. They were the architecture of the world. They shaped where rivers ran. They determined where rain fell. They built the soil that every agricultural civilization eventually grew its food in. They were not decorative. They were structural. The world that humans built everything on top of was, itself, built on top of them. And then, within the span of roughly 60 years, between 1850 and 1910, the majority of them were removed from the planet. People always want a villain in a story like this, a single person or company or government to blame, and the history does contain specific names, specific companies, specific acts of Congress, specific decisions made in specific offices by specific men. But the villain in this story is not a person, it is a mechanism, and understanding the mechanism matters because the mechanism is still running. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. Within 2 years, the population of California went from roughly 14,000 people to over 100,000. Those 100,000 people needed shelter. They needed infrastructure. They needed railroad ties and mine supports and building materials, and they needed them faster than timber could be shipped from the East Coast. The redwood forests of Northern California were standing directly adjacent to the ports. They were, in the economic language of the period, conveniently located. The first commercial sawmill in Humboldt County opened in 1850. By 1890, there were over 100 mills operating along the Northern California coast alone. The technology evolved to match the scale of the resource. Steam power replaced hand tools. Narrow gauge railroads were laid directly into the forest to remove logs that no horse could drag. Entire mountains were deforested, and the timber floated downstream to mills that ran 24 hours a day. Towns appeared overnight around the mills, not towns that happened to have mills. Towns that existed for no reason except the mill, and for no duration beyond the life of the forest that fed it. When the grove was exhausted, the mill closed. The workers moved to the next grove, and the town was simply abandoned. In the cutover regions of the Pacific Northwest, today, you can still find the concrete foundations of mill towns that operated for 15 years and were then completely vacated. Ghost towns where the ghost is a forest. Here is what the economics textbooks leave out, what the environmental histories leave out too on the other side. The men who felled the ancient trees were not unaware of what they were doing. The journals and letters of loggers working the first growth forests in the 1870s and 1880s contained descriptions that read, nothing like the accounts of men processing raw material. They described the smell of freshly cut redwood heartwood as a scent unlike anything else on earth. Multiple independent accounts, written decades apart by men who never met, use nearly the same language. They described the acoustic experience of working inside an old-growth canopy, the way sound moved differently, the way a forest that had never been cut created an environment so quiet that men reported hearing their own heartbeats. And they described over and over the moment of the fall itself. When a tree that had been growing for 1,000 years finally hit the ground, the impact registered as an earthquake. Tremors felt a quarter-mile away. One faller working in Oregon in 1887 wrote in his diary that the sound a large first-growth tree makes in the seconds before it falls is something a man carries with him for the rest of his life. He described it as the sound of something very old saying something you cannot unhear. He was back at work the next morning, not because he was cruel or ignorant, because the economic system he existed inside gave him a single choice: cut the trees or do not feed his family. The forest was not a heritage site, it was his paycheck. In the 1990s, a full century after the primary destruction of the old-growth forests, scientists began mapping something they had not previously known existed at the scale they were finding it. Beneath every ancient forest, threading through the soil between trees, connecting root systems that could be hundreds of meters apart, they found a fungal network of extraordinary complexity. Not unusual, not rare. Present under every intact old-growth forest system they examined, on every continent. These networks were not passive. They were actively transferring carbon, water, phosphorus, and nitrogen between trees, feeding struggling trees from thriving ones, sending chemical